Well, good to see everyone. I think we'll go ahead and dive in this morning. Got a full slate of stuff as I usually do, so I didn't want to mess around too long. The topic we want to talk about today is European missionaries, and this is really the first stage of European mission work. We'll talk about it some more later for the 1900s and 20th century, which are also times of great missionary effort. But this is more the 1600s that we're talking about today. So kind of that first phase of European missions going out. We talked last week, we were finishing up the Reformation period and talking about the Catholic Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, kind of pushing back on Protestantism and trying also to clean up their own act within the church. And so both those things are in flux here, and both of those things are partially why Catholics sent out missionaries in the 1500s. We'll get to that in a minute here. Remember what the map looks like. In the 1500s, the Roman Catholic Church has lost a lot of territory. The orange is still Catholic areas. You've got some mixed Protestant stuff in France. It's a Protestant Catholic overlay. But Switzerland, Germany, and then by the mid-1500s, England and late 1500s, Scotland, all are Protestant areas. And so a lot of territory is kind of evaporated. If you're looking at your holdings as a Roman Catholic, we ain't got as much land under our control as we used to. So in Europe, Roman Catholic Church is losing territory. On the other hand, during this exact same time period, they are planting settlements, colonies in new lands, especially the Spanish Empire in the Americas, all the way up to our area down to South America as well. And so while we're losing territory in Europe, we're gaining territory elsewhere. What can we do about that? Maybe we should try to spread the faith as we go. One other piece last week that becomes important this week, we talked about the Jesuits arising during this period in the Roman Catholic Church's history. And I mentioned they were missionaries. We'll see a lot of that today. The Jesuits are very frontline missionaries during this time period. Not the only ones, but they are very heavily involved in mission work. So they'll certainly be coming up here. Plus, as we said last week, part of their extra vow was that they would be willing to go anywhere in the world on a moment's notice at the orders of the Pope. And so the Pope takes them up on that. South America, here you come. India, Japan, go. Spread things. All right. We also talked last week about some of the open conflict in the 1500s, Switzerland, Germany, later the Spanish Armada trying to invade England. The Roman Catholic Church secretly deploying priests into England and other areas. All this turmoil going on, it flared up, as we said, in the 1600s in the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648. And that's also going to influence some of this mission work during this period. This was kind of one of those watershed moments in European history, last religious war. Really, it's amazing. We'll talk about this next week. In some ways, Europe in the late 1600s is more like the 20th or 21st century as far as religious toleration than it was like Europe in the early 1600s. There really is kind of a watershed crossing of a line here. After the 30 Years' War, people kind of say, okay, maybe the sword is not the most effective way of trying to spread faith. Maybe we need to talk about individual conscience. We'll get to that next week. But that certainly is a piece of this missionary thrust as well. All right, so missionary expansion. So end of 30 Years' War is also going to be another threshold. Before the 30 Years' War, most mission work done is Roman Catholic. After that, the Protestants start to make some initial inroads. The great Protestant missionary movements won't come until later, but after the 30 Years' War, they kind of start doing some mission work themselves. It's almost as if Roman Catholicism has been established for a while, so sending missionaries out, no big deal. Protestants are still trying to gel in a way during the late 15, early 1600s, and so get your act together in your own land. Then we're prepared more to send missionaries out. So there's that piece of things as well. All right, so let's dive in here. So think back to your social studies classes, high school, college, whatever. Remember, Portugal and Spain are the two great seagoing empires. And remember, both of these are Catholic areas. Spain and Portugal, very solidly Roman Catholic areas. And they're also the ones that are starting to explore in the mid to late 1400s and into the 1500s. And so they're going to be a piece of this, this story here because of that. And they go to two different directions. You may remember Portugal went south and east. They kept exploring the coast of Africa, and then eventually they got to India, and then they kept going around India and eventually to China and eventually to Japan and that direction. So Portugal's expansion started, and they went very incrementally. Okay, let's sail here, and next time we'll turn around. Next time we'll try to sail another 500 miles further down the coast, and we'll keep going, just incremental voyages, piece by piece. So down the coast of Africa, eventually around Africa to India, setting up trade with India, and then eventually launching from there into what we would call the Far East, Indonesia, and eventually up to Japan. So that's the Portuguese strategy for expansion, and we'll talk about Brazil in a minute. Don't worry, Armando. The Spanish didn't have kind of that grand, you know, when Portugal has a prince and you call him Henry the Navigator, that says that's kind of built into their culture, that's important to them. Spain, it was kind of an afterthought and kind of an accident in some ways. 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella finally got the political map settled down in Spain. They got rid of any Muslim occupation, any Muslim settlement in Spain, and made Spain a fully Catholic country, Christian country again, after 700 years of various phases of Muslim, Spanish, European overlap there. So in 1492, they're kind of breathing a sigh of relief, and they've had this kooky guy that's been nagging them for a while about funding an expedition. Okay, 1492, we're done with our local regional war here, our internal conflict. So yeah, okay, let's throw some money at this guy, Cristobal Colon, Italian guy, or Christopher Columbus, as we call him. And Columbus had this bizarre idea that you could reach India by sailing west across the Atlantic, not going east around Africa, and you could reach Asia the other way. Now, Columbus, what we have to say about Columbus, there's all kinds of mixed things about him and indigenous Americans. We're going to kind of bracket that off for now. But one thing from a kind of scientific standpoint, Columbus was an absolutely horrible mathematician and geographer. Horrible. And he was also one of the most astoundingly lucky people in the history of the Western world. So there's all kinds of myths. Washington Irving in the early 1800s wrote these myths that Columbus was the only one who believed the world was round. Everybody else thought it was flat. You would sail off the edge of it. That is bull. Even look at Dante from a couple of centuries before. Dante has, purgatory sits opposite the round globe from Jerusalem. They knew it was a globe. They'd known that for centuries. So none of this sailing off the edge of the earth stuff. That was not something they thought. I mean, every sailor knew that you see the steeple, top of the steeple first when you're sailing up, and you see more of the town. So of course you're coming over around a rounded shape that way. Everybody knew that. Go ahead, Jimmy. NBA player. Jimmy.
I guess the circumference part, but that's why the Portuguese wouldn't fund it.
And we'll talk about circumference here in a second. Yeah. The Portuguese knew this guy's a loose cannon. He's got a screw loose here. So okay. So one of the things, not only did they know it was round, they knew how big the Earth was, 25,000 miles, give or take, and that was figured out 240 BC. The great Greek mathematician Eratosthenes was sitting there in Alexandria, and on the day of the summer solstice, and noticing the shadows, and somebody said, down south on this day, there's a well, and the sun goes straight into it. There's no shadow. And so he actually calculated the distance between where he was and where there was no shadow, and figured the angle of shadow, did his geometry, and the guess is he was about 10%, within about 10%. the problem we have is we don't know exactly what his unit of measurement was on the ground. And there's disagreement about that. He could have been off as much as 17%. He could have been, if depending on your definition was a stadia was as a unit of measurement, 0.5% off. He's in the ballpark. Without sailing around the world, just based on shadows, angles, circles, 25,000 miles, give or take, which is what the Earth's circumference is. Columbus had this goofy idea that, all that old stuff's wrong. The Earth is about 3/4 of that size. So it'd be possible to sail west and get to Asia, because Asia is a lot closer than everybody else is wrong. Well, we know, Pacific Ocean is half the Earth basically almost. It's a long way across. And Columbus also said, oh, these maps are wrong about Asia. Asia actually goes a lot further to the east than we think it does. So if you think the ocean is smaller because the Earth's circumference is smaller, and you also think Asia is shifted east, that puts it within range of those little dinky boats that he was taking. He thought it was about 2,700 miles away, not the 10,000 everybody else was saying. Well, he was very wrong. And so Columbus, incredibly lucky, if he hadn't slammed into the Bahamas and been able to replenish his water and everything, they would have died out there in the middle of the ocean. They'd been lost and nobody ever heard of them again. So if there wasn't a couple continents there and some islands, nothing would have happened with him. He would have been lost to history. So very, very lucky. But Spain, so they weren't intending to go out and find these huge new continents, but we found these islands. We've done some more exploring. These islands are connected to other islands nearby, and there's actually some masses of land here. So let's expand our empire. So Spain discovers this vast, quote unquote, new world. Of course, the Vikings were there first. The Chinese may have encountered Western South America, who knows, but they didn't set up permanent structures in the same way that Spain would later. So Spain is going to move west while Portugal is moving east, which is kind of a fascinating accident of history here. And so one of the things in 1494, the Pope actually suggested this, and Spain and Portugal listened to him and said, okay, well, let's make a line of demarcation. We're both great seafaring nations. There's lots of globe out there. Let's slap a line right down the middle. Let's do it halfway between the Portuguese Canary Islands and Columbus's discoveries in the New World. Let's put a line of demarcation there. And Portugal, you can have everything to the east. Spain, you can have everything to the west. And so they did. They had a treaty there. They later, a few decades later, said that line goes all the way around the Earth. And here's the opposite line on the opposite side of the globe. All right, what they weren't aware of is that part of South America actually was on the other side of this line, Brazil, which is one of the reasons Brazil is Portuguese in heritage and still speaks Portuguese, whereas most of Latin America speaks Spanish. So the Portuguese had a little sliver of South America in what we would call Eastern Brazil, but they still had Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Spain, North and South America, and Spain also sailed from Mexico and discovered the Philippines, going the long way around. They weren't aware that they had crossed over that line of demarcation. The Portuguese didn't find the Philippines. They didn't know they were sitting over there. They kind of went around them in their explorations up to Japan and into the East Indies. So by and large, this treaty kind of held. Portugal will kind of push Brazil over the line some as the centuries go on. And Spain has the Philippines over the line as well, but they do some treaties later. Okay, you can keep the Philippines if we can move further east or further west with Brazil. So, okay, they actually, as nation states go, that it actually worked pretty well. This for a couple centuries here. So this bifurcation of the globe. Now, who's not involved here? Well, France is not involved. England's not involved, and Russia. Nobody else is involved except these two countries. And so, not everybody's going to recognize this line of demarcation, but nobody else really is going out doing much. And so, by and large, Spain and Portugal have the globe divided up. All right, so they send out Roman Catholic missionaries into their areas. Later in the 1600s, France, who doesn't care a whit about that treaty, is starting to push exploration into Canada, and they send missionaries into Canada as well. So mid 1600s, this is the situation. We've got Roman Catholic missionaries in the Spanish holdings, in the Portuguese holdings, and a little bit in Quebec, New France up there. If you notice here, let's go to the next slide here. On this map in your book, Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier. Who's this Francis Xavier? So he's making a lot of voyages here. St. Francis Xavier was a Jesuit, friend of Ignatius Loyola, Spaniard. Lots of Spaniards in this era that were important. And perhaps the second greatest missionary after St. Paul in Christianity, because he really is. They call him the Apostle of the Indies and later the Apostle of Japan. He, not quite single-handedly, he had other Jesuits with him, but he is spearheading these missions. By the way, that's a Japanese painting of Ignatius Loyola. It looks very European, very Portuguese. They've got Latin and everything, but then you got Japanese script down here at the bottom of the thing. So Jesuits are pushing missionary work at this point. In Japan, though, there was pushback. Christianity lasted about half a century, and then there was some real pushback. There was cultural pushback. The shogunate, they wanted to close down Japan to all these nasty Europeans, and they were successful for a couple centuries. But there was some persecution. Oh, you follow a crucified God? Well, we can help you with that. Crucifixion became a way of getting rid of some Christians publicly. You don't often see crucified martyrs after the Roman Empire period, but Japan, they did crucify Christians. They also pierced them with spears and things. So that's actually a monument in some Japanese church, Christian church there, to a Jesuit being martyred there. Was he Franciscan? Jimmy's saying, look at his, yeah, he's Franciscan, isn't he? All right. To a nice European there. Japanese and European Christians were martyred here. And the Japanese church really did have to dive deep underground. I mean, deep. They went really deep. The persecution eventually got very, very brutal. In fact, when Europeans got back there and was reopened, they found that there were still Christians there, not tons, but they had functioned for 250 years without clergy. They kept the thing going. They kept passing down the faith secretly. An amazing story, that Japanese church. So that's happening on the far side of the world from Europe. China, things actually went a little bit differently. The Jesuits in China actually asked some what we would call modern questions. How much of missionary work needs to be transmitting European culture? And how much of it is about transmitting the gospel? And back then, most Europeans would say, oh, we're the superior culture, so we of course have to transmit our culture along with the gospel. But the Jesuits in China said, this is an ancient civilization. They've got their act together in some ways better than we do. We need to be very discerning. What things are important and what things can we just let go? And so the Jesuits really tried to enculturate Christianity into China during the 1600s. Jesuits actually started dressing as Chinese folks. Several of them became intimate advisors in the cabinet, for lack of a better word, for the Chinese emperors. They had all this European knowledge, and so the emperors wanted to make use of that and hear their advice. It actually, we would call that kind of a modern thrust there, but it was remarkable given that time period. It was so remarkable that some Spanish missionaries in the Philippines said, these Jesuits in China, they're doing it wrong. Pope, look at them, look what they're doing. You need to put a stop to this. And eventually those voices carried, and the Pope said, you need to be European, and you need to bring our culture. The Chinese emperor said, he didn't say that's cultural imperialism, but that's basically what it was, and what he was accusing of. Said, oh, that's how you're going to play? No more Christian missionaries in my country. Forget it. And so China also banned Christian missionaries later than the Japanese, but in the end, it was kind of the same. No more missionary movement. As later on, we'll see that Christianity got back to China. It was in China before this too. There were some ancient Chinese churches. And I think I've shared this before elsewhere. Right now, Christianity is growing in China faster than any other country in the world. Remarkable. They're going to pass the United States pretty soon, in the number of Christians. 2028 or 2030 or something is the projection. So remarkably fast. But anyway, for now, 1700-ish, borders are closed. All right, Jesuits in the Americas too. Let's talk about them for a minute. South America, in the Spanish part of South America, they came up with this system called reductions or settlements, where they would kind of organize these clusters or areas, almost like monasteries. Let's bring the natives in. Let's have daily prayer. Let's have agriculture around. And let's kind of make this kind of an enclave, not only of Christian teaching, but also spreading European wisdom and culture. Imperialism thing again. Those lasted in South America for a while until the Portuguese started pushing further and further west out of Brazil. And eventually those things kind of disappeared because of the Portuguese westward expansion there. But later on, the Franciscans would pick up that same model. If you go look at the missions in San Antonio, that's how they're organized. You bring the native folks into the mission walls, you teach them how to cook in a European style oven. You have them living in square rooms, around the periphery of, think of Mission San Jose and San Antonio, just, huge compound, much of it, 3/4 of it, 80% of it designed to house native folks, with the monks and Franciscans up in the one corner behind the church. So this would become, Mark.
So that model was exclusively Spanish. That's why the Portuguese changed it, or when they began to expand, that's why it changed.
That's a good question. It was Spanish. I wonder why the Portuguese didn't keep it. There were other things going on with Portugal as well. There was also slavery issues as well. What do we do with the Spanish? Didn't always treat the natives well either, but Portugal also saw some of these folks as potential slaves. So so I don't know of any Portuguese settlements. There may have been, but because the Jesuits would talk to each other, whether they're Spanish, Portuguese, French, whatever, they're all under the same hierarchy. But I've not heard of this with the French so much. I haven't heard of it with the Portuguese.
Actually,
go ahead, Armando, please.
Several cities in Brazil were founded by the Jesuits. These settlements are called missions.
So they had.
Yeah, actually,
Mission,
the city
Mission,
of São Paulo, one of the greatest cities of the
Uh-huh.
world, began with a school built by the Jesuits to teach the native Latin and Portuguese and study the Bible. So everything began with a school that was the center of this little village they created. They were called missions. Even the city is called Mission. But then there was a ruler in Portugal called Marquês do Pombal, who prohibited native languages and the Jesuits, and booted them out of Brazil, because the Portuguese people in São Paulo adopted the native language to be.
Interesting.
Yes, even though they were enslaving the natives. So it's one of the few times in history when people enslaved and adopted the language of the enslaved.
That's wild.
Yeah, and it was a way of these people to protect themselves against the rule of Portugal.
Yeah.
Because the local language was incomprehensible by the Portuguese government, but only understood by those living here, even native or white people, and the Jesuits. So as Portugal wanted to gain more control on this territory, he prohibited both the Indian native language and the Jesuits. So it was a way of gaining more control over this. And from São Paulo, where came all the missions to expand these territories that we call bandeirantes, the flags, because they're taking the flag to the west and gain all this territory. and they were speaking native language and they don't want to respond to Portuguese government. So there was a way of cutting off their wings and keep them under control of the Portuguese Empire.
Fascinating. Thank you. So
Maybe kept some.
the Jesuit side sounds like it trumped the Spanish piece. That's fascinating. Thank you, Armando. Cool. All right. Well, let's talk about further north, our part of the Americas here. Jesuits were certainly part of the French New France settlements, especially tried to, amongst the Iroquois nations and the Huron folks, did some mission work. Our part of the world, the Jesuits, we're mainly a Franciscan area, but the Jesuits had Baja California and Arizona, what we would call Arizona, and then the rest were kind of Franciscan. If you go to Tucson, this beautiful mission was Jesuit, and the Franciscans took it over. So, Jesuits did have it at one point. Yes.
The reason why the formal division of the Franciscans could have this gender to
And they had to,
I think so.
they had to, I'm not sure how pre-planned it was at the beginning, Bob, but eventually they had to kind of divvy up territory. I mean, the American government did that too when Native Americans were put on reservations. The American government said to all the Christian churches, we're not having competing missionaries. Let's throw things in a bowl. You can draw them out. The Episcopal Church drew the Navajo and the Sioux, which is why two of the most concentrated areas of Native American Episcopalians are Navajo land and the Sioux reservations. And other Methodists got other tribes. And so eventually they did have to do some of that with the Roman Catholic Church. And I'm not sure exactly the ins and outs of.
The Franciscans ended up with the Yucatan and southern Mexico, and the Dominicans, I think, were just kind of sprinkled around Peru, especially, I believe. But most of the Jesuits were especially in all throughout, and they were especially in a lot of the more dangerous areas too, on the front lines. And they kind of let the Franciscans have the nicer areas.
Well, and the other thing we have to remember here and keep this in mind, I mean, we're talking, early 1500s through early 1800s. I mean, that's a long swath of territory that the Spanish were planning missions, and not all missions were planted at the same time in all these areas. And so there would be waves and expansions from some of those places. Okay, we've got Santa Fe, now let's go out and push it this way. So Franciscan missionary now, San Juan Capistrano, California, very famous Franciscan missionary. Closer to home, Santa Fe, and trivia, Santa Fe is named, not only is it a Franciscan mission, it's named for St. Francis. Santa Fe means holy faith. It is what the Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, I think is the real name of Santa Fe. The royal village of the holy faith of St. Francis of Assisi, which is why we call it Santa Fe and not, we shorten it considerably, but so Santa Fe, very much a Franciscan foundation. El Paso, we know there's Spanish missions in El Paso, and San Antonio, there's San Jose mission. But trivia, there are actually two areas of missions, Spanish missions, closer to Lubbock than Santa Fe, El Paso, or Santa Fe, or San Antonio. Anybody know about these? Jimmy knows of one cluster because he's been there. So actually, they did some pushing away from the Rio Grande, moving further east. And so in between the Rio Grande and kind of about really halfway between Albuquerque and Ruidoso, basically, is this cluster of three missions. They're now a national monument. If you ever go out that way, the Salinas Pueblo National Monument is a fascinating thing. Ruins of three different missions spread out there. You can barely see, what's the mountain near Ruidoso? Sierra Blanca. You can barely see Sierra Blanca from the southernmost, which is that one in the lower right-hand corner. So, you're kind of getting closer to Ruidoso at that end of the chain. But, if you ever go out there, it's a wonderful set of missions. There's not a bunch of, it's not the Grand Canyon. You're not going to fight lots of crowds in the Salinas Pueblo National Monument. So fascinating. And then there's some little kid in green standing where the altar would have been, pretending he's celebrating mass. So I don't know who that. Actually, it's not a little kid, he's a teenager at that point. But there, that gives you a sense here. This is the sign. That gives you a sense of what it would have looked like back in the day, and this is what the ruins look like now. So fascinating work done closer to Lubbock than we usually think Spanish mission work happening. But there's one cluster even closer. And this one's not been restored, so that's one of the reasons we don't know about it. Yes, it's okay. So on the mission map, this is our diocese here. This is the line of our diocese. There's actually a mission there, not exactly sure exactly where it was, but it's somewhere about halfway between what we call Ballinger and San Angelo. There was a mission there. It was a 2-room mission that was designed for the Apaches. The Comanches hadn't even gotten down here at that point. So it's really, really old. They're still looking for where the ruins are. Then there's another later mission down here by Menard. When you head down, take the backway junction to San Antonio. Menard, and they have not restored the mission, but they have restored a presidio that was built right near the mission. And so we actually have not quite our backyard, but closer than San Antonio and El Paso. They did make some inroads up into the Edwards Aquifer type area there. All right, but nothing to see except if you go out there, you see a sign, Texas historical marker, metal sign, one of those things, and that's all you get. All right, real quick too. Let's mention, I like movies. So let's mention probably 3 great missionary movies from this time period. 2 of them are great movies of all time. One of them is a very good movie. So Mission and Black Robe and Silence. The Mission, 1986 movie. It's one of the great movies of all time, set in Paraguay in the 1750s. And this is the point the Portuguese are trying to push in, and there's some problems with all of that happening. If you haven't seen it, it's a great movie. Church Times in London made it the #1 religious movie of all time on their list that they put out. And the Vatican says it's one of the top 15 religious movies of all time. So interesting. Nominated for 7 Oscars. Robert De Niro, Jeremy Irons, a very, very, very young Liam Neeson, one of his earliest roles. So The Mission. However, I would not recommend it if you have an uncle who was a missionary in Paraguay and Uruguay and is used to humidity, watching it in Austin in the summertime with windows closed and no air conditioning. So my uncle wanted us to see this marvelous movie when he came back, and he's sitting there very calm and collected, and we're all just sweating buckets. And got the windows open, but you can hear the neighbors making noise, and so let's shut the windows so we can hear the movie better. My little niece, who's a baby, she's whining. We strip her down to her diaper. She's sticking to us because it's so sweaty. So the family later called that watching The Mission at Amazon around. We had a special experience of having the humidity and being immersed in it. So it's still a great movie. I still love the movie nonetheless. Okay, further north, Black Robe. Not a great movie, but a very good movie. Set in New France in Canada, a missionary being sent from Quebec to go minister deep into Huron territory. And the French all speak English for some strange reason in this American movie, but it does have the distinction of being one of the most heavily researched pictures of Huron and Iroquois folks. They do speak those languages very accurately from what I'm told. And they try to portray them as accurately as they can. Fascinating movie. And then one of the great movies of all time recently, Silence, nominated for a bunch of Oscars, based on a novel by a Japanese Catholic from 1966. So this is a Japanese Christian writing about Japanese Christians way back in the day. It won their highest, whatever their Japanese Pulitzer Prize is for literature that year. It's about 1640 when things are starting to really crack down from the Japanese shogunate. And persecution is really starting. Liam Neeson's in this one too, and much older Liam Neeson than 30 years earlier in The Mission. Adam Driver, Andrew Garfield, okay. Adam Driver, Liam Neeson, good movie. But one of the things about the novel and about the movie is it's an extended reflection on where is God when things are tough. And it doesn't give easy answers. Though it ends with, I won't do a spoiler, but there is a moment of wonderful hope at the end, in spite of all this. So if you haven't seen Silence, it's a very powerful, but be ready to immerse yourself. It's a tough movie to watch. Yeah, Trey.
So when the Japanese outlawed Christianity, did they expel Europeans?
Some, and the Jesuits, some of them didn't want to go. And just like they did in England, there were Jesuit priests that were smuggled into England to during the Reformation to keep doing things. And so part of it is their fault. They know in this movie, they know they're coming into a hostile area.
So they come in afterward.
They come in after the first
After
wave.
some of the first waves. And part of this is you're kind of these indoctrination camps. And if you'll just forsake Christianity, then we'll let you go on about your life. But we're going to torture the crud out of you until you make that forsaking. Yeah, Bob.
Nagasaki was reserved for generally as a European training center. So European state of Japan was kind of limited to the area
That
around
area.
Nagasaki until after Admiral Perry forced Japan opened because like they sailed warships in
18, whatever. Yeah.
and shocked Japan into saying, oh, wait a minute. You have folks with basically the last weapons, the last modern-ish European weapons introduced into Japan at the time that the country was closed off again. What, during the shogunate, at the time this movie is being.
Right. Gunpowder muskets and things, but yeah.
And then suddenly you have steamships and Gatling guns and stuff like that. And
Gunboat diplomacy.
Japanese government said, well, let's think about modernizing because we could never beat these guys.
Yep.
Which kind of led directly.
Everything else. Yeah. Anyway, great movie, but tough. Just be ready for it. Don't be expecting something light to just spend a couple hours with. It's one of those movies that haunts you afterwards. All right. Let's talk a little bit about Protestants here. So I said earlier, the 30 Years' War is kind of a breaking point. It's not hard and fast, but after this, Protestants start more and more to start doing some expansion, exploration, and missionary work. Having said that, the great Protestant age of missions will be in the 18 and 1900s, but they start to make some significant efforts in the mid to late 1600s. Dutch East India Company, as the Dutch are expanding, they are kind of making inroads in the Portuguese territory. Oh, the Portuguese have these enclaves. We're going to have an enclave next door, or 50 miles down the coast or whatever. And so they started doing that. And they started sending missionaries. A commercial company, interestingly, actually hired a dozen chaplains or something to work for the company to be missions. Company missionaries. So usually that's something structured differently. Dutch East India Company is kind of wild from that standpoint. In the shores of what would become the United States, Massachusetts Bay Company, they were Puritans who settled north of where the Pilgrim separatists were. At first, the folks in Plymouth were not happy with that. Eventually, they said, "Well, at least they're Puritans. I guess we can put up." So Massachusetts Bay is up in Boston, while Plymouth. I mean, it's all one big, huge metro area now. But they did plant a much larger Puritan effort north of where the separatists were in Plymouth. And they started to make some inroads. They weren't doing huge mission trips. We're not going to America to walk in Massachusetts and go all the way across to the Great Plains or anything. But we got the locals here. Let's try to bring the gospel to these locals that are rubbing up against us. And so they started doing that. They even founded what they call praying towns. They were almost like that Jesuit model from South America on a Protestant basis. We're going to try to have these enclaves where we'll teach lots of things. Two of the other groups that did some missionary work, similarly, for those that they're bucking up against, were the Quakers in Pennsylvania and the Baptists in Rhode Island. We're here, they're here, let's share the gospel with them. It's not that they got on a boat from Europe to come to America just for that purpose, but since we're here, let's start pushing the gospel that way. During this time period, the first permanent settlement in our tradition, Jamestown, was built, 1607. Jamestown was one of those settlements that was made mainly to exploit the area, and then you retire and go back home to the mother country. There are kind of two stages of missionary work. One is you go visit and you try to grab everything you can, and then you go back home. Later, you try to put permanent settlements there. Think of the moon. We visited the moon, but we don't have any permanent base up there yet. One day, probably we will, but Jamestown started out that way, and then they realized it was a lousy place to live, so they pushed things to Williamsburg. But anyway, there's the old Anglican church there, but there's a plaque there of them doing Eucharist. And I love this. There's just a table set up under the trees and a tent, actually a sail, and they've done a makeshift altar rail here, and the guys are kneeling to get communion from the priest. So they do that in our tradition is the earliest American Episcopal Church, what will become an Episcopal church later. And the Virginians are very proud of that fact. And so they were getting ready to celebrate their tricentennial in 1907. And the folks in California said, hang on, you are not the first area. Yeah, you may be the first permanent area to have Episcopal services and Episcopal church. But the Diocese of California said, decades before you had Virginia as an Episcopal area, we had the very first service in San Francisco Bay. Francis Drake, the privateer hero if you're English, the state-sponsored terrorist if you're Spanish, who raided Spanish shipping, got off, they landed in San Francisco Bay, they had a service of evening prayer, and then they got back on their boats. And so the first prayer book service is actually in San Francisco, and the Diocese of California erected this large monument in Golden Gate Park, just about a decade before the Jamestown Tricentennial, just to show those Virginia Episcopalians that you're not the first. Yeah, Trey.
This reminds me when I was in 1981, I was traveling to Houston with a friend of mine. We went through Temple and they had these big banners, Temple Centennial, 1881, 1981, and I started laughing. And my friend goes, "Why are you laughing?" I go, El Paso was founded in 1481.
Santa Fe, El Paso, San Antonio's tricentennial recently. So yes. And of course, Lubbock's even later. We have 2008 was our centennial, wasn't it?
So did Francis Drake go around South America?
Oh yeah, he was raiding the West Coast there.
And there's one of the Spanish poets of the period actually has this long epic poem, basically about completely against Francis Drake.
I'm sure. He
just was.
And Queen Elizabeth played the game. I don't even know who this Drake is. He comes back on shore and she knights him immediately. But yeah, thanks for the gold. But Drake who? So anyway, yeah, he's a state-sponsored terrorist is really how we would classify him if we were, unless he's on your side, then he's a hero. All right. Church of England missionaries. That will expand much later on. But there was a priest in our tradition, Thomas Bray, who around 1700 founded a couple groups. One was called the SPG, Society for Propagating the Gospel, to send missionaries out, and also the Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge, the SPCK. And that was to send books out. We've got Americans in their churches, but they don't have enough books in their little parish libraries. So let's print books up, and let's also send missionaries out to the Americas and other English areas to really push things forward. And they wanted to focus on Native Americans and Blacks and also white settlers in North America, especially, and the Caribbean. Just so you know, SPCK and SPG are both active. They both have websites. Got some books on my shelf. Look at the bottom, published by SPCK. So after 300 years, this is 295 years of this one. After 300 years, they're still in operation. So Thomas Bray is one of our great missionary priests in our tradition there. So wanted to mention his name, not a household name by any means, but started something that's still going. It's pretty cool. All right, next week next 2 weeks, actually, the plan is going to be, there's a lot of intellectual stuff going on during this time period. And there's also some stuff that happens on the ground as far as popular movements. So with the people, you've got these popular movements of revivals and revivalism. You also have a lot of intellectual ferment going on with way too much philosophical stuff happening in the Enlightenment. Mark can tell you more about that than I know, probably. But we're going to talk about those in 2 different weeks. So next week, we'll look at kind of the popular from below expansion of Christianity in some ways with revivalism. And then we'll look at some of the intellectual stuff 2 weeks from now. So any thoughts, questions, or comments here? Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
You mentioned the like religious consolidation as why Spain and Portugal was able to begin exploring much earlier, but I'm wondering what like the material or economic factors might have.
You know, Spain was bringing in so much gold that inflation was rampant. You know, they didn't even know how to deal with that much gold coming in.
They literally had a tower in Seville to store gold.
Seville was the landing
Yeah.
spot for all. Once a year, these treasure ships would pull up with, I don't know if
Yeah.
tons of gold is
Yeah.
right, but bunch of gold. That certainly is, you're able to fund a lot of stuff. Yeah.
And so they just started exploring before, and that's where they got all the gold, right?
Right, gold and silver from South, you know, the Andes in Central America, had some silver mines and things too, so.
It was better gold and silver than they had in Europe before too. It was a better quality.
Was it? I didn't,
Yeah.
okay. You know, and then so, yeah, so that, you can throw a lot of money at things. In Spain, we forget how wealthy these countries got because, I mean, and think about the Portuguese too, what they're bringing in. They're bringing in spices. That's what Columbus had access to. You know, you don't get cinnamon from Europe. You don't get it from the grocery store. You've got to import the stuff. You don't get peppers. You know, the Europeans start to love this stuff, and we've got to bring it in from somewhere. Then you've got tobacco and sugar from the Caribbean and North America later on, also became popular. Yeah, Trey.
This made me think about the wrecks of Spanish treasure ships, and I guess maybe Portuguese too, that when people discover them, there's a squabble about who gets the gold. Does it go to Spain? Does it go to where they got it in the first place? I mean,
Is it the native country? Yeah, the native country should have it, or is it Spain gets it, or the discoverer? Yeah.
I mean, is there finder's fee or something?
Well, you know, if it's lost, you know, I guess maritime law, if it's lost out in the middle of the ocean, it's kind of free game at that point. But if it's in somebody's territorial waters, you know, if it's off a atoll in the Bahamas, you know, I'd leave that one to the lawyers, to maritime lawyers sort that one out. But yeah, I mean, there's still stuff out there, still Spanish wrecks and things that get discovered from time to time.
One other thing in Spain and everything, I was just gonna say there, a lot of times the people, the like conquistadors and everything coming back would want to kind of atone for some of the stuff they did, and so they would donate tons of money and stuff to the churches there, and so they would literally just build these huge tabernacles in like pure silver and gold, and just they're sitting on the altar still, and they weigh tons.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow.
just-
You know,
Yeah.
throw some, I feel guilty about
Yeah.
the raping and pillaging I did, so here's some money to the church
Yeah.
in my old age. But, yeah. Fascinating. All right, y'all. Well, we'll stop there and pick up next week. And I know we've got spring break next week. We're going to just plow ahead, and you know, these are on. We'll be on YouTube eventually. So good to see y'all. Yes.